So today we're going to do something a little bit different. Today we're going to do a modern deck, and not only is it a modern deck, it's a budget modern deck. This card here is going to give you a little hint about what's to come, and I suppose also if you read the video title you would know as well, but this deck is something I like to call Mono Red Affinity. So many of you are probably already aware, but not that long ago there was a tier 1 deck called Affinity, and the idea with it was that you would play so many artifacts like this where it costs 0, or maybe you would play ones that cost 1, and you would basically dump out your entire hand onto the battlefield on turn 1 or 2 and win through using things like Arcbound Ravager, Cranial Plating, Steel Overseer, things like that. But when Mox Opal got banned, that deck took a pretty big hit, and it hasn't really been the same since. Like, you don't really see it so much anymore. What I've done here is taken the idea with that deck and kind of substituted a little bit of the speed and dumping out all of your artifacts with playing some burn spells instead, and also made it budget friendly. I originally saw a deck similar to this years ago on MTG Goldfish, and that's how I started playing this, but it's kind of morphed a little bit as I've been playing it. I like to play this on Magic Online sometimes because it's quite cheap, but also it's pretty good. I find that it can reliably win against tier 1 decks, and I'm not going to say that you're going to take this to a Grand Prix and, expect a top 8 with it or anything like that. Like, it's not a tier 1 deck, but at the same time, I feel like this is the kind of deck that you could take to FNM and expect to have an actual chance at doing pretty well. But just before we get into it, if you'd like to purchase any of the cards that you see here today, you can get those by heading on over to 401games.ca. And if you use my promo code, you'll save 10% on your purchase of any Magic the Gathering singles. So let's start off with this card here, Memnite. We're playing 4 copies of this. This is one of the holdovers from the original Affinity deck. And just like the old Affinity deck in Modern, that deck didn't actually have any cards with the ability Affinity on them. That's the same with this deck. It's just a name for the deck. It doesn't actually have anything with the Affinity ability in it. But we're playing this for the same reason that deck did. It costs 0, it's an artifact, and it's a 1/1, so you can just put this into play for free on turn 1. You get an artifact already that can start upping your artifact count, and I mean, it's a 1/1, so it can start attacking. So definitely we're playing 4 copies of Memnite, and also, this is actually one of the most expensive cards in the deck. Memnite, it's a little bit pricey nowadays, maybe $4 or $5, something like that. But it isn't uncommon, so as soon as it gets reprinted, the price of that's going to go way down. So that'll help out with the budget even more. So we've got 4 Memnites. Very similar to Memnite, we're also playing 4 copies of Ornithopter. This one also only costs 0. It's a 0/2, so it doesn't attack so well, but it has flying. But despite having 0 power, this can end up being a pretty decent attacker with some other cards that you'll see in just a moment. So we're playing 4 copies of Ornithopter as well. Now moving up the curve to 1-drops, playing 4 copies of Bomat Courier. This card was very popular in Standard. It was pretty big in Pioneer for a while too. I don't think that it's ever done a whole lot in Modern, but it's a card that you see show up occasionally. This is a 1-mana artifact. It's a 1/1 with haste. It says whenever it attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. Also, you can pay a red and discard your hand and sacrifice this to put all cards exiled with Bomat Courier into their owner's hands. So this is a hasty attacker for 1 mana, which is an artifact that can get you a significant amount of card advantage. This card is a lot better than it seemed at first. Like, this went under the radar when it was spoiled and it took a little bit to catch on, but you can draw a lot of cards off of this if it goes unchecked. And it actually works pretty well in multiples too, because you can stack these abilities in a way that you can keep all of the cards that you would put into your hand from both of them. So say you have like 3 cards underneath 2 of them, you just sacrifice 1, and then in response to this trigger, sacrifice the other, so you discard your hand, and you discard a hand again, so you discard nothing because you've already discarded it. And you put all the cards into your hand, so it works well in multiples that way even. A couple more 1-drops here with Arcbound Worker. So in the original Affinity deck, you wouldn't really see this card. This is kind of one of the budget inclusions, but it actually works pretty well. It's, it doesn't do a lot on its own, but what it does do works quite well in this deck. So it's a 1-drop 0/0 artifact, but it comes into play with a 1/1 counter on it because it has a modular ability. And whenever this card goes to the graveyard, you can put its 1/1 counters on another artifact creature. So this card helps us up our artifact count early on. It can also attack, and also when it dies, you get some value too. So 2 copies of Arcbound Worker there. Still got some more 1-drops though. This is one that was definitely played in the old Affinity deck, Signal Pest. So this is a 1-mana artifact. It's a 0/1. It has the Battle Cry ability though, so whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 till end of turn. Also, this can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. So this is another card where, at first glance, it seems a little bit mopey, but it actually does a lot of work. Because while it doesn't buff itself, it can attack without having fear of being blocked. So say if you start your turn by going like Ornithopter, Memnite, and then you spend your mana to play this. On turn 2, you could attack with your 3 creatures, including this, and then this would give basically an extra 2 power because it would buff both your Ornithopter and your Memnite. And that's on the very low end of what this can do, because this deck can tend to go somewhat wide. So this is, an invasive threat that can buff your whole board. So we're playing 4 copies of this one. And that's it for the 1-drops, kind of. So we're going to move up the curve here, but not actually, because we're going to Vault Skirge, another card from the Affinity deck. So this costs 2, but it doesn't really, because it costs 1 and then a Phyrexian black mana, which means you can pay either a black or 2 life to play this. And since we're playing a mono red deck, basically this costs 1 and 2 life, but it's definitely worth that 2 life, because for the 1 mana and the 2 life, you get a 1/1 artifact creature with both flying and lifelink. So this card does so much work. It's great against other aggressive decks like Burn or something like that because it has lifelink, and when combined with something like Cranial Plating, you can be gaining a lot of life off of that, but also just the fact that it's, an evasive 1-drop artifact. This can, start attacking quite early without really having any fear of being blocked. So definitely we're playing 4 copies of this. I'll put this in the 2-drop slot, but like I said, this is basically another 1-drop. So moving up to the actual 2-drops now, we've got a card that was one of the very key cards from the old Affinity deck with Arcbound Ravager here. So this one is a 2-drop to 0/0, but it has modular 1, so it comes into play with a 1/1 counter on it. But it has this ability, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Arcbound Ravager. I'm going to try my best to do this card justice, but the power of this card in an Affinity deck is kind of hard to overstate, because, it comes into play as a 1/1, but just the ability to, at any point, you can sacrifice an artifact, put a 1/1 counter on Arcbound Ravager. However, what you can also do with this is it doesn't say sacrifice another artifact, just an artifact. So this can sacrifice itself. It has the modular ability. So that means that you can, at any point, you can move around counters basically to whatever artifact creature you want. Because say you have a couple of artifact lands, you could sacrifice those, put 2 counters on this, and then if you want to put those counters on, say, an Ornithopter because it has flying, you could sag this, and then when this dies, the modular ability will let you put those counters onto the Ornithopter. So this thing allows you to basically condense all of your artifacts onto one big thing, and you can do that at instant speed. So if you have multiple attackers, you can do that after your opponent blocks. So this card is very powerful. I actually only have 1 of these in the deck right now. Originally, I was playing this with 4 copies of it, but the thing that I found is an actual 2-drop, like one where you have to pay 2 and not just 1 mana and 1 and 2 life, that's kind of a lot for this deck because, like I said, the original Affinity deck, that had access to Mox Opal, but this doesn't. So spending an actual 2 mana to play your creature is kind of a lot when we have so many 0 and 1 drops. So I've lowered it down to 1 copy. I feel like that might end up being too low. Maybe the sweet spot would be 2 copies, maybe 3, but I feel like 1 or 2 copies works pretty well. Definitely I want to have some number of Arcbound Ravager in the deck. Another thing though is this is, I believe, the most valuable card in the deck, so adding more copies makes it less budget friendly, but at the same time I think this is sitting around $15 right now, so you know, it's not so bad. Going to the 3 drops now, here's another one that you would sometimes see in the old Affinity decks. This is Etched Champion. This one is a very powerful card, so it costs 3 mana, it's a 2/2 artifact creature. Soldier doesn't really matter, just artifact is what we care about. It has Metalcraft though, so Etched Champion has protection from all colors as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. So this is one where you can kind of get your opponent with it, because a lot of times when you play this, if you have the Metalcraft ability turned on, there's nothing they can do about it, because you can just, like, it has protection from all colors, so unless they have a colorless creature they can block with, you can just slap a Cranial Plating on this and kind of go to town, and there's nothing they can really do about it, except for maybe try and turn off Metalcraft. So you have to be kind of careful with this, playing it when it won't be too vulnerable. Just keep in mind that, you know, your opponent can remove some of your artifacts, and this can lose the Metalcraft ability, and then won't have protection anymore. There's 1 copy of this that I have in the main deck, and then there's another one in the sideboard, because there are some matchups where you want multiple copies of this, but I'm a pretty big fan of playing one-ofs in decks, so this is a one-of in the main deck that I like to play here. So that's it for the creatures in the main deck. There's a pretty decent amount of them. We've got 24 creatures here, so we're going to move on to some utility artifacts here. Another one from the old Affinity deck, Springleaf Drum. We're playing 4 copies of this. This card is another one of the key cards from both the old Affinity deck and this one as well. And the reason for that is, let's take a look at it. Costs 1 mana, it's an artifact. You can tap this, and also tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this is one of the cards that lets us get some crazy starts. With the old Affinity deck, it would be this plus Mox Opal, and you would be able to go nuts and dump your whole hand into play on turn 1. We don't have Mox Opal, but we do still have this. So this works really well in combination with any one of your 0-cost artifact creatures, because what you can do is, say on turn 1, you play your land, you spend 0 to play one of these, your Ornithopter or Memnite, you use your land to play your Springleaf Drum, you tap your Springleaf Drum and your creature, and now you have 1 mana, so you can spend that on whatever you want. Maybe you want to play an Arcbound Worker, or a Bomat Courier, or a Vault Skirge or something. So right there, that allows us to put in 4 permanents to play on turn 1. And also, if you have, you know, multiple copies of the 0-cost things and the Springleaf Drums, then you still can potentially put your whole hand into play in turn 1 with this version of the deck. So Springleaf Drum is one of the key cards that allows this deck to keep up some of the speed from the old Affinity deck. So we've got all these little creatures and a way to put them into play fast, but we need a way to make them actually good, right? So here's the card, another one of the key cards from this deck and from old Affinity. In Cranial Plating, this card is one that, you know, the deck absolutely needs. And it's kind of a busted card. So 2 mana equipment, it says equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Also, you can pay black and attach Cranial Plating to a creature you control. So the thing with that is you can do that at instant speed if you have access to 2 black, but also this equips for just 1 mana. So usually Cranial Plating will end up giving your creature at least +5/+0, but you know, that could be even more. So, like, because all of these things are artifacts, right? But also we have artifact lands too, and this is an artifact itself. So it's not uncommon to, you know, suit up an Ornithopter or Vault Skirge with a Cranial Plating, and then it gets, you know, +5 or +6, +7/+0, something like that, right? This ability was a lot more relevant with the other Affinity deck. It's not so relevant in this one because we don't have access to Mox Opal, so the only way in this deck that we can generate black mana is through Springleaf Drum. If we have 2 Springleaf Drums, then yes, we can do this. Definitely playing 4 copies of Cranial Plating, though. So far, this is actually still pretty close to the old Tier 1 Affinity deck. That one didn't play Arcbound Worker or Bomat Courier, but all these other cards you would often see in the main deck. But since this deck doesn't have access to Mox Opal, we need to switch it up a little bit. And some of the different cards that I've added here are a couple more equipment that we can use to take advantage of our cheap creatures. And also, they're budget friendly as well. So we've got 1 copy of Bonesplitter. It's nice and simple. It's just 1 mana artifact. Equipped creature gets +2/+0 and equips for just 1. So, it's a nice, cheap, early threat that we can suit up an Ornithopter or, Vault Skirge, Memnite, anything with, right? You can go turn 1 Memnite this, turn 2 equip attack, get in for 3 damage. That's not so bad, right? Like, it's not an amazing card, but it works surprisingly well for just being this cheap little common. Very similar to this, we have a new card, which is Eater of Virtue. This is almost the same as a Bonesplitter. So it costs 1, gives a creature +2/+0, and you can equip it for 1. I'm going to try and translate this on the fly for you. This is a legendary one, though, so that's the reason we're not playing 2 copies of this. We're playing 1 copy of this and 1 Bonesplitter, because this one is just straight up better than Bonesplitter outside of being legendary, so you can't have multiple copies of it in play at once. But what makes this better is it has this extra ability. It says, if equipped creature would die, exile it. As long as a card exiled with Eater of Virtue has flying, equipped creature also has flying. The same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. This is actually pretty relevant in this deck because Vault Skirge has both flying and lifelink. So if a Vault Skirge is equipped with this and it dies, it gets exiled, and then anything else you equip with this would then gain flying and lifelink. Ornithopter has flying as well, so you can actually take advantage of this ability pretty well in this deck. But like I said, the reason that we're only playing 1 is because it's legendary. Next, you're about to see why this is a mono red deck. So this is going to start to differ a little bit more from the old Affinity deck after we get past this next card. So just like the old Affinity deck, we're playing Galvanic Blast. I'm not sure if that one would always play 4 copies of it. I don't think that it would always play it, but definitely in this deck, we're playing 4 copies of Galvanic Blast. This card is super good for just 1 mana at instant speed. This does 2 damage to any target, but if you have Metalcraft, so if you have 3 or more artifacts, this does 4 damage to any target instead. 4 damage to any target for 1 mana at instant speed is an insanely good rate. So usually we'll just want to chuck this at the opponent's face because this is a very aggressive deck, but this can actually take care of some pretty big threats or blockers as well. We're definitely playing 4 copies of Galvanic Blast. Continuing with the theme of playing burn spells with Blast in their name, we're also playing Shrapnel Blast. This is another very powerful card, so for 2 mana at instant speed, this deals 5 damage to any target. However, as an additional cost to cast this, you have to sacrifice an artifact. You can see we have tons of artifacts here though, so chances are we're going to have at least 1 artifact we can sacrifice to play this. We're playing only 2 copies of this though. I've seen some versions of this deck like to play 4 copies of it. I did try that out, but I cut it down to 2. The reason for that is this costs 2 mana, and like I said earlier, even though that's only 2, that is kind of a high cost for a card in this deck. But also, I usually don't want to see multiple copies of this in my hand at once. I would like to see 1 copy, but having 2 is not great because sacrificing an artifact is, an actual cost. Because we want to be doing other things with their artifacts as well, and not just sacking them for this. So I'm playing 2 because, 5 damage is a lot for 1 card, and there are definitely lots of games that I've played where this is like pretty much the only thing that I can draw to get me to win the game, and if I have 2 copies of it, I have a much better chance of drawing it when I need it than if I only had 1 copy. But if I have more than 2, then there's a pretty high chance that I might see 2 in my hand at once, which I don't really want to see. Next, we've got a somewhat new card that you see pop up occasionally in modern decks with Light Up the Stage. This is one where other versions of decks like this I see typically don't play it, but I'm a pretty big fan of this card. I've got 2 copies of it in here. This is basically just card advantage. What you would see the old Affinity deck would play is Thoughtcast, because that had access to blue mana in the form of typically at least 1 island, as well as Springleaf Drum and Mox Opal, and Thoughtcast would let you draw 2 cards. This kind of does the same thing, but it's the red version of that, so it's the impulse draw, right? So it costs 3 mana normally, but if you have Spectacle, which means if the opponent has been dealt damage this turn, or has lost life this turn, you can spend only 1 instead. It says exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn, you can play those cards. So this is a way to get some card advantage for just 1 mana. And, you know, chances are we'll be able to play both of the cards that we get off of this because everything in the deck is so cheap anyway, right? And this is also a way to dig for lands if you really need to hit some land drops. So I feel like 2 copies is a good number for this. It's one that I find myself sideboarding out frequently. If I need to find something to take out, I'll swap this for something else, but it's something that I think works pretty well in the main deck and kind of like a flex spot. Next up is one of my favorite cards, actually. I love playing this card, Experimental Frenzy. Another, you know, somewhat new card. It's a 4 mana enchantment. It's a little bit of a weird one. It says you can look at the top card of your library anytime. You can play the top card of your library. You can't play cards from your hand. And you can pay 4 mana to destroy Experimental Frenzy. So basically, this card turns off your hand, but turns the top of your deck into your hand. So with this, assuming you have enough mana, you can just keep on playing cards from the top of your deck. That includes lands, so you can keep going through your deck until you hit 2 lands, because you can play your land from the top of your deck to hit your land drop, but then once you've made your land drop, you can't play another land, right? But this deck plays a very low number of lands, so you can churn through the deck super fast with this card. I'm only playing 1 copy of it because, well, one reason is it doesn't work very well in multiples, because having 2 copies of this doesn't really benefit you at all, aside from having the safety of having extra 1 if one gets destroyed for some reason. But like I was saying, 2 mana is a lot for this deck. That means that 4 mana is really a lot for this deck, and it is. But at the same time, I want to have at least 1 copy of this, because if you can get this in play, then you can just start going through your whole deck. Like, it's kind of nuts, because you have so many cards here that cost 0 mana, so those are just free, right? And I've had several games where this is the reason, like explicitly the reason that I win, because like say I'm playing against like blue-white or Jeskai Control or something. If I can resolve this, then my chances of winning go from, probably less than 50% to so much higher, because like I just get so much card advantage with this. It's pretty crazy. This, however, is one of the cards that I also find myself cutting somewhat frequently after sideboarding, because it's very good in some matchups, but in aggressive matchups or against very fast combo decks, basically against any deck where they're looking to win on turn 3 or maybe even earlier, this card isn't really going to do anything because it costs too much. You're not going to be able to play it in time. But in games where they're playing a long game, they're playing control-y, or they're trying to play like a grind you out game, this card can do so much work. So that's it for all the spells. I mentioned that we're not playing that many lands. There's 17 lands in this deck. It's a super low number, but the reason for that is it's because the curve is so low. Also because many of our cards here cost 0 mana, but we have Springleaf Drum as well to kind of supplement our lack of lands. These can kind of be seen as extra lands. That's, it's not exactly like a 1-for-1 comparison, but these do help to supplement our mana that we're missing from not having other lands. But for the lands, we're playing definitely 4 copies of Darksteel Citadel, because it's an artifact land. This is one of the few artifact lands that you can play in Modern, which comes into play untapped. Like, we got the whole cycle of 2-colored artifact lands from Modern Horizons, but those come into play tapped. So for this kind of deck, we don't want tapped lands. We want all of our lands to come into play untapped. So this works quite perfectly. It helps up our artifact count. It only produces colorless mana, but that's fine because, as you can see here, only these cards require colored mana. There's also the ability from Bomat Courier that you need red for, or if you want to try and shift over Cranial Plating, you need double black, but usually that ability doesn't come up so often. But definitely 4 copies of Darksteel Citadel to try and make a little bit of room for lands off to the side here. Next up, just like the old Affinity, we're playing this card, Blinkmoth Nexus. We're playing 4 copies of it. This is another one of the most expensive cards in the deck at, I don't know, like $5 or $6 or something. Maybe a little bit more, but Blinkmoth is great because it's a creature on a land. So it's a land that comes into play untapped. You can tap it to add colorless. Or you can pay 1 and have it become a 1/1 Blinkmoth artifact creature with flying till end of turn. It's still a land. Also has this other ability, you can pay 1 and tap it to give a Blinkmoth creature +1/+1 till end of turn. That's not going to come up so often, but it can be relevant sometimes because if you have multiples of these, one could buff another. This is great though because it's an evasive creature on a land. It's an artifact creature when you turn it on. And also, this doesn't die to sorcery speed removal, so like board wipes or anything like that, you're pretty safe with this. There's a lot of times where all your creatures might die, but you'll have this left over because your opponent just can't deal with it because they don't have the right removal. But this card does a lot of work in this deck, so we're definitely playing 4 copies of it. So far the only red source of mana you've seen is Springleaf Drum. Next up, we've got another one of my favorite cards here, Ramunap Ruins. So because this is a colorless and mono red deck, we have quite a few slots in our lands where we can play utility lands, and I've chosen to play a full 4 copies of Ramunap Ruins. I'm a big fan of this card. I've won so many games where this is literally the only way that I can win the game, because say I'm playing against control or something like that, I've grinded them down to 2 life or maybe 1 life, but they've stabilized. They have, a handful of counter spells, so if I play anything, it's just going to get countered. But Ramunap Ruins is a way to get through a situation like that, because what this does is it's a desert, comes into play untapped, quite relevant there. You can tap it to add a colorless, or you can pay 1 life to add a red. But it has this other ability, you can pay 2 and a red and tap and sacrifice a desert to have this deal 2 damage to each opponent. So this is a burn spell on a land which can't be countered, like unless your opponent uses like a stifle kind of effect to counter the ability. But this is a burn spell that you don't have to cast a spell to use because it's just on a land. So, if you have the mana to play this and your opponent is at 2 or less life, kind of they just lose, because most of the time there's nothing they can do about that. And one of the things that I really like about this is that it's an untapped land that we can get either colorless or red for. And it works pretty well here because, you do have to pay a life for the red, but so many of these cards are just colorless, right? So most of the time when I tap this, I'm not even paying any life for it because I'll just use it for the colorless mana. Next up, for another land, we've got... Wait, how did this get in here? Next up for another land, we've got a new card here from currently the newest set from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, the Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. This is the red land from the Channel Land cycle. So this comes into play untapped, taps for a red. So usually if you're playing a mountain, you can just swap it out for this unless you have a reason to need basic lands. But has the channel ability, we can pay 4 and discard this to create 2 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens. They gain haste till end of turn, cost 1 less to activate for each legendary creature we control, which is, there's no legendary creatures in here, so this is always going to cost 4. but this is kind of in here because it basically costs us nothing to be able to play this. I'm only playing one copy of this because like this is always going to cost 4 mana, which is kind of a lot for this deck. So most of the time when I see this card, I'm just going to play it as a land. But I would like to have at least one copy of it for, you know, the times where the ability does become relevant. Then this card's going to be really good. But since most of the time I'm playing it as a land, I really don't want 2 copies of it because it's legendary. So, you know, that wouldn't work out quite the way I want it to. But I feel like 1 copy is the perfect number for this deck. And then the rest is just 4 mountains. These could be more utility lands. I've experimented with some other lands in this deck. Like, you could try and play something like Castle Embereth, but I don't think that would be that good because most of the time that's going to come into play tapped because you only have these mountains. You could play a colorless utility land, or maybe like Den of the Bugbear. That could potentially work well in this deck. So there is some flex room in these cards here, but I want these lands to at least provide red mana because currently we only have 5 red producing lands here, and that's kind of a low number. We do have the Springleaf Drum, which is good, but I just don't like being in this situation where, you know, I'm stuck with a bunch of red cards in my hand and no way to cast them, right? Which does happen sometimes. But right now I've got these 4 mountains in here. I could see this working pretty well with maybe 1 fewer mountain, and you could put in another utility land like I don't know, maybe you could play an Inkmoth Nexus. That's gonna up the cost of the deck a lot, but Inkmoth is one that I should probably point out because that's one of the cards which was another one of the kind of key cards in the old Affinity deck that we're not playing in this deck. One of the major reasons is because of budget, because right now that card's sitting at like maybe $40 to $45 each, so it's not so budget friendly. So as always, the sideboard is meta dependent, so this will, you know, change depending on what the meta is like in your area or what it's like during any given time, but I'll show you what I've picked out for it at the moment. So for some artifact hate, we've got Smash to Smithereens. This works quite well in this deck because this is an aggro deck, and Smash to Smithereens, not only does it remove an artifact at instant speed, it also does 3 damage to the artifact's controller. So it's kind of perfect for artifact removal in this deck. So 3 copies of this. We've got Whipflare, 2 copies of this one. This is a great sweeper for Affinity kind of decks. You would see this in the sideboard of the old Affinity deck. So for 2 mana, sorcery speed, Whipflare does 2 damage to each non-artifact creature. So basically, this does 2 damage to each creature you don't control, because all of your creatures are artifacts. I guess aside from the spirit tokens from the channel land, but aside from that, this is not going to hit any of your creatures. So, you know, 2 mana for that effect is quite good. This is good against go wide decks, like against elves or something like that maybe. This can do a lot of work. I like this card so much, Ghirapur Aether Grid. We've got 2 copies of this on the sideboard. This is a 3 mana enchantment. It says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Ghirapur Aether Grid deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Maybe that's any target. I'm not sure if that's being errated or not, but anyway, this card works so well in grindy matchups. It's another one of the cards kind of similar to Experimental Frenzy, where say you're playing against control and you resolve one of these, your chances of winning just go up so much because, like, you saw there are so many artifacts in the deck, right? So you're probably going to have at least 4 artifacts in play, and that means every turn you can tap 2 of those to do 1 damage. If you have 4, you can do 2 damage because you tap 2 of them twice. You can do that at instant speed, and notably it's any artifact. It doesn't have to be an artifact creature or anything, so you can tap your equipment, which normally wouldn't tap, but you can get use of it out of it that way anyway. This also works great against go wide decks like elves because you can just ping down all their little creatures, right? I like this card a lot. Got a second copy of Experimental Frenzy, just to board in against some really grindy or controlling matchups. There are some matchups where I would want to have access to 2 copies of it just to up my chances of drawing it, or to have an extra one if my first one gets countered. For some graveyard hate, we've got 3 copies of Tormod's Crypt. It's pretty awesome for graveyard hate in this deck because it's another 0-cost artifact. So that's going to help to up our artifact count, and also it's graveyard hate that we can threaten to use at instant speed. Got a little bit of land destruction here with Cleansing Wildfire. Just there, you know, against, let me say like Tron or something, or just any kind of deck where they're relying on having specific lands. Cleansing Wildfire can do some work, and it's pretty cheap for just 2 mana, so a couple copies of that. Here's one that I think is cool, Sea Gate Wreckage. This is a utility land that I had in the main deck for a long time. I might end up swapping it back in, just remove a mountain for this. But I think this card works quite well in this deck. So it taps for a colorless, comes into play untapped, and you can pay 2 and a colorless, tap this, and draw a card. Activate this ability only if you have no cards in the hand. So that's actually pretty good for this deck because essentially you're paying 4 mana to draw a card. You pay 3, you tap this one, so that's 4 in total. You have to pay a colorless, notably, not just generic, you have to pay colorless, but a lot, like most of our lands produce colorless mana. Activate only if you have no cards in hand. Well, this deck wants to dump its hand into play as soon as possible, right? So there are a lot of times where you have no cards in your hand and you're just playing off the top of your deck, so this can work pretty well. So I have it in the sideboard because I like to board it in when I board in things like Experimental Frenzy and Ghirapur Ether Grid to go along and up my land count a little bit, just to have a higher chance of being able to pay for these higher costs. But like I said, this is one where I would consider swapping it back into the main deck, just maybe take out a mountain for it. And then also just a second copy of Etched Champion here, just to bring in an extra copy in the matchups where I do want to have Etched Champion. It's good to have an extra copy of it. And that does it for the deck. As I said, for a budget deck, I think this is quite good. It's one that I like to play on Magic Online because I don't like to spend a lot of money on Magic Online. So it's one where I can play without having to sink really much cost at all into the game and actually be able to win some games against, you know, good people playing good decks. There are some ways that you could upgrade this deck, like maybe you want to play Blinkmoth Nexus. If you want to up the budget a bit, you can definitely fit that in here, I think. And I think there's also a decent amount of room for customization in the deck. Like, I feel like a pretty high number of the cards that I went over are kind of flex spots. So, like, I could see myself playing, you know, upwards of maybe 4 or 5 different cards in the deck that I'm not playing any copies of right now. So let me know what you think. Like, what do you think of the deck? Do you have any suggestions for things that I should or shouldn't be playing? Have you played a deck like this in the past? Let me know your experience if you have. Otherwise, though, if you're still watching, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of the patrons who support me on Patreon. If you're interested in checking that out, you can find a link to it in the video description. But otherwise, though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later. This video is brought to you by 401 Games. Visit 401games.ca and use code 8thPlaceDave at the checkout to receive a 10% discount on your purchase of any TCG singles.